what I propose is to make what I hope will be a brief presentation of the note we prepared and a quick overview of the draft modalities text prepared by the chairman. It's hard to make it brief because, of course, the modalities themselves are already very comprehensive and very long. Our comments are already also a 30+ page document. But I'll try to cover at least the most salient aspects of it, and I apologize already if I'm not covering an area of your interest. Now, as you know, the text is an unilateral proposal by the chairman. He does not engage on any of the delegations. He says that himself, the chairman says that himself in his text. And it is a text that is still to be negotiated, as you know very well as well. So we can assume that there's as the WTO language usually goes, that there are brackets around the entire text, and everything in it is open for discussion. However, you know very well as well that some of those elements in the text are more consolidated than others, and some are easier to change than others. And this is proven by the fact that some brackets that existed in the previous frameworks, in Annex B of 2004 and in the Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration as well, some of those brackets have been removed in this current text, and others have been added. We'll comment on some of them. And I would say that even if the entire text has to be discussed, and in that sense it is open for debate, I think that it is already a very important document for at least two reasons. One, because it provides a very good already idea and profile of what the NAMA modalities will look like at the end of these negotiations. And in that sense allows already the delegations to make a preliminary assessment of NAMA according to their own interests. And then together with the text of agriculture, it allows you to it allows your delegations to have a good idea already of the core areas of the Doha round, basically Pascal Lamy's triangle of issues. So in that sense, both texts together constitute already enough material for our delegations to advise your capital on the direction the round is taking and the benefits and costs of these modalities for your delegations. The second reason why I think it's also important is because the chairman proposed in his text close to final language in about all areas of the negotiations. And in that sense, any comment or any suggestion that may come up now in September will be assessed against that language that was proposed already. Possible new proposals will have to be at least as operational or at least as acceptable or crafted in at least as similar legal language as that proposed by the chairman. Otherwise, the delegations could always fall back on whatever has been proposed by the chairman already. Now, on some general comments on the text. First, on the objective. The chairman says himself that his objective through the text is to force or encourage, invite negotiations and compromise among the delegations. And this, in a way, could seem paradoxical with the fact that he proposes final language already in most all of the topics. He doesn't provide options or alternatives to foster the negotiations, but provides already one benchmark or one yardstick and asks the delegation to basically compromise towards that middle ground that he proposed. In terms of the scope, as I said, there's final language for almost all areas of the negotiations. I would say maybe 90 or 85% of the topics covered under NAMA. There are maybe only 5 areas which were left open for further negotiation, and those were sectoral initiatives, the non-tariff barriers, transparency in the flexibilities of paragraph 8, which he does not preclude from coming up again in the near future, rules of origin for the LDCs, which are also unmentioned in the modalities, and then environmental goods. In terms of the structure of the paper, as you might have seen already, the first part are comments of the chairman to his own modalities, where he basically explains more or less the principles, the guiding principles that he used in drafting these modalities. And the second part are the modalities themselves, already crafted in legal language, containing annexes and legal instruments. Finally, on the general elements, the chairman says himself that he was guided by 2 principles in drafting these modalities, and I think these principles are very important, and I think in fact that some of the criticisms that the text received in July were more on these principles than on the modalities themselves. And the two principles were, one, that all the delegations must contribute in the round. And of course, it's the chairman himself who deemed the extent of those contributions, depending on his consultations and on previous proposals. But he says himself that he wasn't shy in proposing real contributions for the various delegations. The second principle that guided the chairman was that there should be a hierarchy in the contributions. That means that depending on the delegations and their perceived level of development, there is also a crescendo or a gradual level in the contributions that was required by from the different groups in the negotiating group. And here, one of the questions I think is how do you measure that hierarchy? And of course, all groups are pegged. But what I think is a bit striking is that there's to some extent something very arbitrary in that hierarchy, because it's not established according to the different industrial capacity or industrial level of development of the different WTO members, but rather on a more negotiating basis and not on an economic basis. Now, on the specific elements that the chairman tackled in his text, first, of course, maybe the new element there and the most important is the formula and the coefficients that were proposed already in the formula for the first time. The formula proposed is a simple Swiss formula that would apply to developed countries and a small group of developing countries, about 30 developing countries. It removes the hypothetical language that had been used in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we talked about a working hypothesis of a Swiss formula. This time, it's a quite clear option for the Swiss formula. And of course, that eliminates all other options, at least in principle. It eliminates the ADI option, which had been discussed some time ago. That is not totally surprising because it hasn't been really discussed recently. But it also eliminates the Uruguay round approach, which had been recently discussed because of the NAMA 11 proposal, as you know. And I would say that the Uruguay round approach is totally eliminated according to the modalities proposed by the chairman. And that, in a way, is also different from the approach that was taken in agriculture, where that option was kept there only as a backfall position, or only as an alternative option in case we cannot go through the modalities that we are discussing now. The Swiss formula, the text also confirms that the Swiss formula would apply on all non-agricultural tariff lines on a line-by-line basis, both on the bound tariff lines, the tariff lines bound at the WTO, and on the tariffs that were not bound at the WTO, that means the unbound lines, through a marking up exercise. And the text also proposes the figure of 20 points for the markup for the unbound lines, which actually is somewhere between what the defensive side, the developing countries, had proposed 30 points there. The offensive side had proposed 5, so 20 is okay, but we had already assessed and discussed in working lunches here that actually the value of the markup matters little, and what really matters there is the value of the formula and the coefficients of the formula. And in fact, with even a markup of 20, you still have reductions to the applied unbound rates whenever the tariff line is above 12 or 15%. So you do have quite drastic reductions, particularly for high unbound tariffs. Now, what is new here, I said before, is the coefficients, the figures for the coefficients, which were proposed on paper for the first time, and here the numbers given were 8 or 9 for the developed countries, which is a very narrow range that also came up in July as an issue, of course, and makes little difference. A coefficient of 8 or 9 would trigger a reduction of 29 or 26% average reduction for the US, and 33 to 30% for the EU on average reduction. So you see the difference is fairly small, 30 to 33 or 26 to 28. But I would say the coefficients are still quite efficient in reducing peaks, the tariff peaks of developed country. You have reductions of up to 85% more or less in the United States and 75% in the European Union. So of course, Had the coefficient been even lower, you would have a greater reduction of these peaks, but it's still a quite substantive reduction. Now, on the developing country side, the paper proposes a coefficient of either 19 or 23, or somewhere between both. And I would say that the values there, the figures there, were written in brackets, alluding to the fact that the actual figures would be under negotiation. Now, for developing country, the range, the width of the range proposed is also very small and makes to some extent little difference. For all developing countries applying the formula, the lowest coefficient would trigger reductions of 55% on average, and the highest coefficient, 23, would trigger reductions of 50% on average, so 55, 50, not a big difference depending on the coefficient chosen. But I would say that the level of the coefficient does trigger quite important reductions that reduce or eliminate, in most cases, the water or the overhang between the unbound tariff levels and the applied levels. And there are also actually levels that reduce quite dramatically as well tariff peaks in developing countries. You have reductions of peaks of up to 90% in the developing countries applying the formula. Now, what are the consequences of the figures proposed? Of course, the immediate consequence is its relationship with less than full reciprocity. Here we said developing countries making about 55% reductions and developing country making 43% reductions on average. So according at least to what the NAMA 11 had proposed as an understanding for less than full reciprocity, the figures would not respect that internal balancing NAMA between the commitments of developed countries and those of developing countries. And that becomes even more evident if one isolates only NAMA 11 countries and the three major developed countries. The NAMA 11 countries will be making reductions of about 60%, and the EU, US, and Japan would be making reductions of about 30% only. So there the difference is even more staggering maybe. So as I said, the first consequence is in the internal balance of NAMA. The second, and the fact that if you want to keep the internal balance according to what the NAMA 11 had proposed for an understanding of less than full reciprocity, you would require a coefficient for the developing countries of about 37, or a bit higher actually, 38, 37 in the Swiss formula. And the question there, of course, is whether a coefficient of 37 or 35 or whatever is feasible, politically speaking, in the group. The second consequence is how these figures relate then to the modalities that were proposed in agriculture. And we don't have to start this discussion now, and I think that is also something that is very individual to the different delegations. But of course, you know that several delegations will link these numbers to whatever ambition was proposed in agriculture, and you know that that link is actually mandated by paragraph 24 of agriculture as well. And I would also add that many comments made to the text say that actually the NAMA paper is much, much more ambitious than the agricultural paper. Another element that complements the formula, as you know, are the flexibilities that were in paragraph 8, typically referred to as paragraph 8 flexibilities. And here it's just a confirmation of the figures, of the values that had been in this paragraph already, in the sense that the brackets that were in the figures, in the values there, were removed by the chairman in this text. So it confirms that developing countries would have the flexibility of exempting 5% of their tariff lines from the formula, or applying half formula reductions on 10% of their tariff lines. As you know, the text also confirms that both flexibilities cannot be cumulated or combined. It's or, either or. And as you know, access to these flexibilities are conditional upon a series of limitations as well. What is new in the text is that the chairman does include a third option in the flexibilities. That was the Mexican proposal. Countries that decide to forego the option of exempting certain tariff lines from the formula can then have a 3-point higher coefficient in the formula. So countries that don't utilize paragraph 8 would be able to apply a formula with coefficients of 22 to 26. Now, one of the questions according to these modalities is now, if the values here are set and cannot be cumulated, and this is assuming, of course, that the brackets have been removed. So we are talking in a scenario that these flexibilities are set, then the only area left to increase the flexibility of the tariff reduction approach is through the coefficients of the formula, and that puts a lot of burden, of course, in the negotiation of the values of these coefficients, whereas before maybe, of course, there's always been a lot of pressure in these numbers, but they could be counterbalanced through an increase of the flexibilities as well. Now that seems not to be possible now. Another new element of the proposed text is the implementation period, for which for the first time as well numbers are proposed. And here the text says that developed countries would reduce their tariffs according to the formula in 5 years and in equal installments. So there would not be the possibility of front-loading or back-loading the reductions. They would have to be implemented in equal installments over the implementation period. For developing countries, including actually paragraph 6 countries and the small and vulnerable economies, the period given was 9 years, and there again without the possibility of backloading. So the reductions would have to be implemented in equal installments over the 9 years that were provided, and starting from the first year actually. Now the option of not allowing countries to backload their commitments has advantages, of course. Those countries that are hoping to gain benefits, market access benefits from the round, will see some of these benefits materializing from early stages of the implementation, but it also comes with challenges, of course, and particularly for countries that would face losses from tariff reductions, let's say either fiscal losses or losses through the erosion of preferences. It is possible that these losses start materializing already from the beginning of the implementation period as well. And I would add that actually this type of scheduling is also more complex administratively speaking, because it will require the capitals to plan in about 3 months, or before they submit their schedules of commitments to the group. They will require the capitals to plan now the reductions year by year, product by product, over the coming 9 years, which could be actually a challenge for some countries. Now on implementation period still, on recently exceeded members, the solution given to this group was basically to give them 2 additional years to implement their concessions, and also a rest period of 2 years, meaning that once they finalize the implementation of their accession obligations, they'll have the option of waiting 2 years before they start implementing any Doha concession. And then also still on implementation, there's a link here to preference erosion, and it's been proposed that for a limited list of products in the US market and the EU product, which are provided by the chairman in annexes, these products would be reduced through a longer implementation period as well, basically of 2 additional years, meaning that for preference products, the EU and the US would implement reductions over 7 years and not 5 years. Now, I know this is getting long. As I said, it's difficult to run through all the elements in a very short period of time, but to sum up maybe on the rest of the smaller groups that are not applying the formula, small and vulnerable economies, the text confirms the approach that had been proposed by the proponents, meaning a banded approach to tariff reductions, but the ambition is way above what the group had originally proposed. It asks the group to adopt new tariff averages of 22, 18 and 14% depending on the bands, with minimum reductions of 10% on all tariff lines, and it excludes the group from accessing paragraph 8 flexibilities. However, the group is provided 5% of their tariff lines without linear reductions on these lines, so a 5% flexibility there. The average reductions that would be required from the group are between 40% and 70%, depending on the bands and on the countries. So actually, in terms of ambition, it's similar or very similar to the ambition that is proposed under the formula. However, it is true that these are not line-by-line reductions, it's average reductions only. On recently exceeded members, as you know as well, there's a graduation in these countries. So some of the recently acceded members will make no concessions at all, and this applies to 6 RANs. Then 5 other RANs will make reductions through the small and vulnerable economies modalities. And finally, 4 other recently acceded members, including China, would make reductions through the formula. And the flexibility that is given to this latter group of countries is that they'll have longer implementation period, as I've commented. Now, on the former paragraph 6, which here became now paragraph 7 countries, the novelty is that the text confirms the amount of tariffs that the group would have to bind as a result of NAMA, and here it's proposed that they bind 90% of their tariffs, of all their tariffs, non-agricultural tariffs, at an average rate of 28.5%. The 28.5% has not been really discussed recently, although of course there's a relationship between the tariff rate and the level of binding coverage, and here it's the binding coverage that is new in the text. For least developed countries now, the text basically confirms what had been already on the table, that the group will make no concessions, but it doesn't comment anything on least developed countries that would actually be impacted by the application of the Swiss formula because of their membership to regional trade agreements. This is the case of Lesotho, but also potentially of other SADC members, Mozambique, Angola, Tanzania, who would be member of a common external tariff zone, and as a result of South Africa being member of that grouping, they would also need to adjust or reform their tariffs to conform with whatever South Africa is bound to undertake as part of the NAMA reductions. On least developed countries still, something that is actually quite striking is that the modalities fail to mention anything on rules of origin, despite a very detailed proposal of the group in 2006 of which type of rules of origin the group would have wished adopted as a result of the round. Here the modalities are totally silent, and the chairman in his comments basically suggests that the group should take it bilaterally with whoever is implementing preferential schemes for the LDCs. And on duty-free and quota-free, the text doesn't propose anything new, it just confirms whatever had been already discussed, meaning that countries should inform which products already enjoy duty-free and quota-free, the scheme through which they do so, and also inform an indicative and only indicative timeline for the inclusion of excluded products in the duty-free and quota-free treatment for LDCs. Now, after that quite extensive, and I apologize for that presentation, in conclusion I would say that, as you see, it's very detailed modalities that was proposed. So technically speaking, and only from the point of view of the technicality of the text, it can be adopted very, very quickly. The issue here is more of a political issue at this stage, I guess. I would also say that it's a very complex set of modalities, probably the most complex modalities that have always have ever been negotiated or adopted as part of a round, which then brings me again to link these modalities with what had been commented by the chairman of agriculture, meaning if we start with so many technicalities and subgroups and flexibilities and different sets of modalities, maybe it is best to question the entire architecture of the modalities and, for instance, think of the Uruguay round approach, which is much more flexible for all the delegations. And finally, the question here, since we're talking about architecture, is now, can we temper or adjust the values or the figures that are proposed in the text so that the text can accommodate the different concerns and priorities of the delegations, or what is actually required is a questioning of the architecture of the group? And here is maybe just an open question that I throw to you, and I'm happy to hear your comments on it. Thank you very much.